The words hung in the air, leaving Amara with more questions than answers. She wanted to press them further, to demand clarity, but the look in their eyes told her that the truth wasn't something they were willing to share easily. "Why did you help me?" she asked, her voice trembling slightly. The older man's expression softened, but his answer was as vague as ever. "Because no one deserves to face that kind of hatred alone." Amara stared at them, the weight of their mysterious presence leaving her with a sense of unease. They had intervened when no one else had, but there was something about them that didn't sit right. They weren't simply strangers. They felt like they carried burdens, secrets, things that tied them to the very tensions they'd spoken of. "Be careful," the older man warned gently. "There's more to this than you know." Before Amara could respond, they turned and started walking down the street, their figures disappearing into the night. She watched them go, her thoughts swirling. The encounter had left more questions than answers, and the uneasy feeling that this wasn't the end. What were they hiding? And why did they seem so certain that danger was far from over? Amara knew one thing. Her life was about to change in ways she never expected. Amara stood in silence, her eyes fixed on the empty street where the two strangers had just disappeared. The faint sound of footsteps echoed in her mind, their voices still lingering. She didn't know what to make of it, who they were, why they had stepped in. All she could focus on was the unsettling sense that something was deeply wrong. Back at home, Amara couldn't shake the image of the gang leader's face from her mind. His eyes had been filled with something darker than mere malice. It wasn't just about intimidation. There had been a depth of bitterness in his gaze, like he was fighting battles that went far beyond that one street corner. Questions flooded Amara's thoughts. Who were these people, and what was the real danger they had mentioned? The next morning, Amara found herself unable to concentrate. Her thoughts were clouded, her usual morning routine feeling more like a chore. The encounter from the night before was always there, hovering in the background of her mind, refusing to let go. Every time she tried to focus on work or school, her thoughts drifted back to the two strangers. Who were they? What had they seen? And why had they chosen to step in? At school, Amara noticed that things seemed different. Small, subtle changes. People seemed more guarded, more wary. She couldn't shake the feeling that the tension in her neighborhood wasn't limited to what she had seen the night before. It was as though there was a ripple effect, a shift in the air that everyone was beginning to feel, even if they didn't know why. Her friends noticed too, though no one spoke about it directly. Conversations became quieter, glances more cautious. Amara tried to brush it off, but she couldn't ignore the feeling that something was building, something bigger than just the encounter with the gang. Meanwhile, the older man and the teen were navigating their own concerns. They moved through the shadows of the neighborhood, keeping to quiet corners and hidden paths. They didn't speak much about their past, only hints here and there that hinted at a history of struggle, one that neither of them could escape. The teen, barely out of adolescence, carried a weight far beyond his years. His name was Marcus, but that wasn't what plagued his thoughts. What haunted him was the sense of responsibility he carried, the knowledge that the neighborhood had fallen into chaos. His own family had been torn apart by the same forces he couldn't ignore. When they had spotted Amara, he had known instinctively that her presence wasn't going to make things any easier. In fact, it would only stir things up. The older man, whose name was Leo, bore a heavy silence. He moved like someone who had seen too much and lived too long with the ghosts of his past. The street they had grown up on wasn't the same as it had once been. In its place, a tension hung, an invisible force that neither of them could escape. Leo had known for years that something was brewing. He had seen the signs, though he never expected them to boil over this way. The gang had been emboldened, their behavior growing more reckless. He had been trying to hold on to what little peace remained, but now it felt like that peace was slipping through his fingers. When Leo and Marcus crossed paths with Amara, they knew that her involvement was only going to deepen the conflict. The gang hesitated, the grip on their words loosening. The older man stepped forward slightly, his presence imposing but measured. The teen followed his lead, keeping his gaze locked on the leader, his grip tightening on the skateboard. The air between them crackled with the unspoken possibility of violence. Amara, still caught in the middle, watched the standoff with bated breath. She didn't know these two strangers, but she felt safer with them than she had since the gang first started closing in on her. Her heartbeat pounded in her ears, and every second that passed felt like a small eternity. "I said walk away." The leader barked, his confidence slipping further. He wasn't used to being challenged, not like this. The gang shifted, glancing at one another, their usual bravado fading as doubt crept in. The older man took another step, his eyes never leaving the gang leader. "We're not going anywhere," he said. "But you can." For a moment, there was silence, a stillness that felt deafening. Amara could feel the weight of every second, the tension in her chest tightening. The gang didn't move, but the leader's eyes narrowed as if weighing his options. Then, without warning, he let out a low growl and turned away, his gang following reluctantly behind him. Amara didn't breathe until they were out of sight, their footsteps fading into the distance. The older man kept his gaze on the empty street, his expression unreadable, while the teen shifted awkwardly beside him. Finally, Amara broke the silence. "Thank you," she said softly, her voice trembling. She wasn't sure if the words would reach them, but they did. The older man turned to look at her, his features softer now, though still guarded. "You shouldn't have to thank strangers," he replied, his voice rough but kind. The teenager gave her a shy nod, still clutching his skateboard like it was a lifeline. Amara tried to smile, but the weight of the encounter lingered. Who are you two?" The older man exhaled, his eyes sweeping over her, as though trying to assess her. "Just people passing through," he said. "You shouldn't be out here by yourself." Amara bit her lip, suddenly feeling vulnerable again. "I live nearby," she said quietly. "I walk this street all the time. I've never." "Seen them before?" the teen interrupted. His voice was hesitant, unsure, as though he was struggling to understand the situation as much as she was. Amara nodded. "No, I don't know who they are." The older man studied her for a long moment. "They're trouble. They've been causing trouble around here." "That's why you stepped in?" Amara asked, glancing between them. "To stop them." The man hesitated before nodding. "We couldn't let them continue." There was a silence that followed, heavier than before. Amara felt like she was standing in the middle of a puzzle she couldn't quite piece together. Who were these two strangers, and why had they decided to step into her life like that? She wanted to ask more questions, but something told her they wouldn't be answered so easily. "Who were they?" she finally asked, breaking the silence. The older man sighed, running a hand through his graying hair. "Just a group of young men looking to prove something. About power, about respect. They thought they could intimidate you. But that's not the kind of neighborhood this used to be." Amara frowned, the weight of his words sinking in. "Used to be." The man exchanged a glance with the teen, as though silently agreeing on how much they should reveal. "Things have been changing here," he said. "People moving in, tensions rising. Some old problems creeping back." Amara took a step back, her mind racing. Old problems? What kind of problems? The teen spoke this time, his voice quieter. The kind that don't go away easy. Amara wasn't sure how to respond. She could feel the shadows of the night closing in around her. These two, whoever they were, seemed to know something she didn't. Something about her neighborhood that had been left unsaid, unspoken. For a moment, the air between them thickened. Amara wanted answers, but she wasn't sure if they were ready to give them. "Who are you?" she asked again, her voice barely above a whisper. The older man exhaled slowly, his eyes distant. "We're just people who've seen too much." It was a crisp autumn evening, the kind where the air carries a slight chill and the leaves crunch underfoot. In a small suburban neighborhood, the streets were quiet, the hum of distant traffic barely audible. People were settling in for the night, unaware that a story was about to unfold, one that would leave a lasting impact on everyone involved. Amara, a young black woman with a warm smile and a sharp sense of humor, had just finished her shift at the local bookstore. She loved her job, surrounded by stories of every kind, but tonight she was eager to get home. She tucked her coat tighter as she walked down the dimly lit street, her footsteps echoing in the stillness. She wasn't expecting trouble. This was a neighborhood she knew well, one where she felt safe. But sometimes safety can be an illusion. As Amara rounded the corner, she noticed a group of men leaning against a parked car. They were loud, laughing, and tossing a bottle back and forth. Their voices carried through the air, sharp and mocking. Amara's first instinct was to walk past without making eye contact, as she'd done countless times before in situations like this. But tonight felt different. There was a tension in the air, something unspoken but palpable. "Hey, look who we've got here," one of the men called out as she approached. His tone was laced with a cruel edge that made her stomach tighten. She kept walking, hoping they'd lose interest, but their laughter grew louder, their words more pointed. They began to close in, their taunts turning into insults, each one more hateful than the last. Amara's heart pounded as she tried to steady her breathing. She wasn't a stranger to prejudice. She faced her share of it growing up. But this was something else. This was a group emboldened by each other, feeding off their shared malice. It wasn't just words anymore. It was a show of power, meant to intimidate and degrade. But what they didn't know was that Amara wasn't alone. Across the street, a pair of strangers had been watching the scene unfold. One was an older man with a gruff exterior but kind eyes. The other, a teenage boy with a skateboard tucked under his arm, looked hesitant but determined. They didn't know each other, but in that moment, they shared an unspoken understanding. This wasn't right, and they couldn't stand by and let it happen. As the gang grew more aggressive, Amara stopped in her tracks. She turned to face them, her voice steady despite the fear that gripped her. "Leave me alone," she said firmly, her words cutting through their laughter like a knife. The leader of the group smirked, stepping closer as if to test her resolve. But before he could say another word, a voice rang out from across the street. "Hey, back off." It was the older man, his tone commanding and unyielding. The teenage boy stood beside him, his skateboard now in hand like a makeshift shield. For a moment, the gang faltered, surprised by this sudden intervention. Amara's eyes met the older man's, a flicker of relief washing over her face. But the night was far from over, and the confrontation had only just begun. What followed would challenge everyone involved, revealing truths about courage, community, and the power of standing up for what's right. This introduction sets the stage for a gripping and impactful story, drawing the audience in with relatable emotions and a sense of suspense. Let me know if you'd like any tweaks. Amara didn't know what to expect as she locked eyes with the older man across the street. His stance was calm but unwavering, as though he'd been in situations like this before. The teenage boy beside him seemed unsure, his hands fidgeting with the skateboard, but he didn't back down. Together, they formed a silent wall between Amara and the gang. The gang leader, now taken aback by the unexpected interruption, sized up the newcomers. His smirk faltered for a moment, replaced by something harder to read: frustration, confusion, maybe even fear. Amara could feel his gaze shift, calculating whether these two strangers were worth the trouble. "Who do you think you are?" The leader spat, his voice lower now, less assured. "This ain't none of your business." But the older man didn't waver. His voice was calm, yet firm. "It is now," he said, his tone cutting through the tension like a blade. "Walk away." They weren't sure how yet, but they could sense it. The threads of her life now intertwined with theirs in ways they couldn't control. Leo had tried to protect the neighborhood in his own way, but even he couldn't keep the growing storm at bay forever. Amara's life had always been defined by her desire for normalcy. She didn't ask for any of this. All she wanted was to go back to the way things had been before the encounter with the gang and those two strangers. But as the days passed, she couldn't ignore the growing sense of unease. It felt like the neighborhood was shifting beneath her feet, and she was caught in the middle of something far beyond her understanding. In the background, the gang continued to stir. Though they had disappeared from sight that night, Amara couldn't shake the feeling that they weren't done. Their leader, whoever he was, had something more to prove, a vendetta that wasn't going to let go easily. Amara tried to focus on the present, but the weight of the past was impossible to escape. She thought about her family, the people she loved, and the fear that they might be drawn into something far more dangerous than a simple confrontation. The older man in Marcus had mentioned old problems, but what did that mean? What exactly had been brewing beneath the surface of her once peaceful neighborhood? Every street corner seemed to carry a silent warning. The trees, the houses, the shadows, they all felt heavier now. Amara couldn't shake the feeling that something had changed, something far deeper than she could understand. One night, after tossing and turning for what felt like hours, Amara couldn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the ceiling, the weight of the previous days pressing down on her. She thought about the gang, the strangers, and the uncertainty of what lay ahead. There was no clear answer, no way to see through the fog of her own doubts. But deep down, she knew that things couldn't go back to the way they were. She decided she couldn't ignore the feeling anymore. There was something unfinished, something waiting just out of sight. And she wasn't the only one who felt it. The nights grew colder, and the silence of the neighborhood felt heavier than before. Amara couldn't escape the feeling that something was looming just beyond her sight. The tension crackled like static electricity in the air, and every street lamp seemed to dim, casting longer shadows that stretched farther than they should. It was as if the very fabric of the place had begun to fray, unraveling in slow, painful stretches. One evening, as Amara walked home from work, she saw something that made her heart skip a beat. The gang was back, no longer lurking in the background, but standing directly in the middle of the street, their faces shrouded by the dim glow of a flickering street lamp. There was a new edge to them, a kind of focus that made Amara's skin crawl. They weren't just random troublemakers anymore. They were hunting. Fear tightened in her chest as she tried to make herself invisible, her eyes wide, her breath shallow. The gang's leader stood at the front, his gaze scanning the street, but Amara knew he wasn't just looking for someone. He was searching for her asterisk. She quickly ducked into a nearby alley, her heart pounding. The cold bricks of the wall pressed against her back, but she hardly felt them. Every second stretched out like an eternity. What did they want? Why were they back? And how had things spiraled so far out of control? In the distance, she could hear them laughing, harsh, cruel laughter that sent shivers down her spine. Amara couldn't stay hidden forever. They were searching, drawing closer. She couldn't breathe. Her thoughts raced. She needed answers. The older man in Marcus had been right about the danger, about the storm that had been building. But they hadn't prepared her for this. She didn't know how to fight back, or if she even could. As the minutes ticked by, Amara knew she couldn't wait any longer. The gang wasn't going away on its own. With a deep breath, she forced herself out of the alley, her footsteps hesitant but steady. She had to find Leo and Marcus, the only people she trusted to understand what was happening. Amara didn't know where they lived, but she had a feeling they would know where to go. They were the only ones who had seen what was coming, the only ones who seemed to know the gravity of the situation. The street seemed to shift under her as she walked, as though the ground itself was telling her she was heading into something far beyond her control. It wasn't long before she found herself in the same neighborhood, walking toward a building that looked as though it had seen better days. The air felt thick as she approached the door, her knuckles white as she knocked. Seconds passed, each one stretching into uncertainty. Finally, the door opened, revealing Leo. His face was worn but resolute, his eyes locking onto hers. Without a word, he stepped aside, letting her in. "What is it?" Leo asked, his voice low, his expression guarded. Amara didn't waste time. "The gang, they're back. They're searching for me." Leo didn't hesitate. "They won't stop. We knew they wouldn't." Marcus appeared from the shadows, his face grim. His gaze shifted to Amara. "They've been waiting. This isn't random anymore." Amara felt her throat tighten. "Why? What do they want from me?" Leo ran a hand through his hair, his frustration clear. "They're trying to send a message. They think you're connected to something bigger, something they're trying to control." Marcus added, "They want power, and they'll do whatever it takes to get it." Amara's mind spun. Power? What did they mean? She was just an ordinary woman, trying to live her life. Why would anyone connect her to something like that? The weight of their words sank in, and the more she thought about it, the more everything felt like it was unraveling. "Leo," Amara said, her voice trembling, "what do we do?" But Leo didn't have an answer. His usual calm demeanor cracked as he exhaled, running a hand through his graying hair. "There's only one way this ends," he said, his tone raw. "We stop them." Amara's chest tightened. "And how do we do that?" Leo's silence stretched long before he spoke again. "We confront them. We face whatever they've become." A wave of fear surged through her, but there was no turning back. The gang wasn't just a random threat anymore. They were the storm that had been brewing beneath the surface, waiting for the right moment to explode. The tension was suffocating. Amara could feel it in her bones, each passing second bringing them closer to an inevitable clash. But what terrified her the most was not knowing how far they would go. The stakes had never felt higher, and the truth was, she wasn't sure if any of them would make it out alive. As they prepared, Amara couldn't shake the feeling that whatever lay ahead would change everything. And the deeper they went, the darker the unknown became. As the night deepened, Amara, Leo, and Marcus prepared to face whatever came next. The tension hung heavy in the air. Each step they took closer to the inevitable confrontation. But the fear that had gripped Amara was soon replaced by something far more unsettling. The realization that the gang's return wasn't the only danger they had to face. They hadn't noticed it before, but the quiet murmur of whispers had started to surface from the shadows of the neighborhood. Strange figures moved in the distance, their silhouettes blending with the darkness. Amara couldn't shake the feeling that they were being watched. It wasn't just the gang that was after them. There was something else lurking in the background. Leo noticed it too. His usually steady gaze sharpened as he glanced toward the edges of the street, his instincts kicking in. "They're not alone," he muttered, more to himself than anyone else. "What do you mean?" Amara asked, her voice trembling as she scanned the surroundings. "They've brought others," Leo said, his tone grim. "There's something else here, something darker than we expected." Marcus clenched his fists, his body tense. More than the gang. What could they possibly want from us now? Amara's heart pounded. The unease she had felt earlier now blossomed into full-blown terror. They had barely managed to fend off the gang once before, but this? Whatever was lurking in the shadows felt far more menacing, far more calculated. "We've been fighting shadows," Leo said, his voice low and weighted. "But these aren't just ordinary people. They've brought something ancient." Marcus glanced at him, his face a mix of fear and confusion. "Ancient? What do you mean?" Leo's jaw tightened as he pushed back the memories. This neighborhood wasn't always like this. There's a history here, one that's been buried, but not forgotten. There are forces that have been waiting, gathering strength in the darkness. Amara felt a chill run down her spine. Forces? What kind of forces? "They're remnants of something long past," Leo explained. "Things that thrive on fear, on chaos. They fed off this place before, long before you were born. And now they've returned." The weight of his words sank in, each syllable deepening the dread in Amara's chest. How could something so ancient and sinister still exist? And what did they want from her and the neighborhood? Suddenly, the faint sound of chanting echoed through the streets. It was distant at first, but it grew louder, growing more rhythmic, more sinister. Amara froze in place, her breath hitching as the sound reverberated through the air. "What is that?" she whispered, her voice trembling. "Something stirring," Leo said, his gaze narrowing. "They've come for something more than just control." Marcus's eyes darkened as he stepped closer to Amara. "Whatever they're after, it's bigger than us. Bigger than just this neighborhood." Amara could feel her legs weaken. The ground beneath her felt unstable, like the very foundations of the neighborhood were shifting. Fear gripped her as she tried to make sense of it all. What were they after? What had they awakened? The chanting grew louder, surrounding them now, as if the very air itself was alive with it. Amara could see the shadows twisting, dancing, forming shapes that seemed almost human, but not quite. They were watching, waiting. Leo tightened his grip on his jacket. "They're looking for something tied to this place's past. And they'll use anyone to get it." Amara couldn't help but wonder what they meant by past. Was it something tied to the neighborhood, something connected to her family, or even deeper, something buried in her own identity? A sudden noise snapped her from her thoughts. The ground beneath their feet trembled, the walls of nearby buildings groaning as if something unseen was awakening. The air seemed to vibrate, a low, ominous hum resonating through every fiber of her being. "They're here," Leo said, his voice barely above a whisper. Before Amara could react, the chanting stopped. Silence fell, heavier than before. And then, from the shadows, they emerged. Figures, dark, hollow, and silent, began to step out from the abyss. Their eyes glowed faintly, as though they had no souls of their own. They moved with unnatural grace, their forms shifting in and out of focus, blending seamlessly with the night. Amara couldn't look away. Her mind raced, trying to comprehend what she was seeing. What are they?" she managed to ask. Leo stepped in front of her, his expression hard. "They're the echoes of this place, the ones we thought were lost. But now, they've come back." Marcus clenched his fists, stepping beside Leo. "They're after something, and we're in their way." Amara's heart pounded in her chest. She felt powerless, lost in a world where nothing seemed real. The figures surrounding them didn't seem like humans, or anything she could recognize. They were shadows of something far older, something far more dangerous. The silence stretched, But then one of the figures began to speak. Its voice was hollow, like the echoes of a long-forgotten past. "We've been waiting," it murmured. "You cannot escape what's been destined." Amara's breath hitched. The words felt ancient, weighted with meaning she didn't understand. Destined for what? She whispered, but no one answered. The figures advanced, closing the space between them. Amara could feel the others tightening their defenses, but deep down, she knew the fight was far from over. Whatever these creatures were, they weren't just after control. They were after something far deeper, something that could change everything. And Amara was about to face it, whether she was ready or not. Amara's heart pounded as the eerie figures loomed closer. They moved with a haunting silence, their hollow eyes fixed on her. She could feel the weight of their gaze, as though they were peering into the depths of her very soul. The air was thick with dread, suffocating and oppressive. Leo stepped forward, his voice steady despite the trembling in his hands. "They're not here by accident. These are the echoes of the past, the forces that never truly left." The figure closest to them spoke again, its voice echoing through the night. "You think you can fight what's already been written? We have always been here. We are the ones who shaped this place." Amara felt the ground beneath her shift, as though the very earth had memories of its own. She glanced at Marcus, who stood with his fists clenched, his face etched with determination. "They've been waiting for us to unlock the door," Marcus said, his voice low and gravelly. Leo turned to Amara, his gaze steady. "You're connected to this place, Amara. It's not just your neighborhood anymore. They're after something within you." Her breath hitched, and she shook her head. "What do you mean? I'm not part of whatever this is." Leo didn't answer right away. Instead, his eyes darkened as he locked onto the figure speaking. "They think you hold the key." The figure stepped closer, its form shifting, the darkness of its figure twisting into something more human. "The key to what was lost. You carry it, whether you know it or not." Amara felt the weight of those words. The air crackled with tension as she realized there was something far greater at play. Something connected to the gang, the ancient figures, and her own identity. In a sudden burst of realization, Amara remembered the night her family disappeared. The memories surfaced, blurred and fragmented, but undeniably tied to this place. Her family had been searching for answers, just like she was now. A surge of defiance rose within her. "I don't know what you're talking about, but I won't let you control my life." The figure didn't react, its gaze unyielding. "You will fight, but it won't be enough. The past will always claim what belongs to it." Amara clenched her fists. "No, I won't let them take control." Suddenly, a voice rang out from the shadows, familiar yet unexpected. It was Marcus. "They don't understand what they're up against." The figure turned toward him, its expression shifting slightly in curiosity. "And what are **U* supposed to be, boy?" "I'm more than what you think," Marcus said, his tone steady. "This neighborhood isn't just a place of power for you. It belongs to us too." Amara watched as Marcus stepped forward, his presence more commanding, his energy vibrating with something unknown. His eyes glowed faintly, a light that Amara hadn't noticed before. "Marcus," Amara whispered, confusion flashing in her eyes. "They think they can control everything," Marcus continued, his voice stronger now. "But there's more to this than they realize." The figure hesitated, its voice turning quieter, uncertain. "And what makes you so sure?" Marcus stepped closer, his gaze fierce. "Because we've been here longer than you think, and we're not leaving." In an instant, something shifted. The figures, once towering and imposing, seemed to waver, their forms flickering like shadows in the light. Amara could feel the ground trembling beneath her feet, as if the entire neighborhood was waking up. Leo watched, his expression hardening. They were relying on fear, but fear only controls those who give it power. Amara felt a wave of clarity wash over her. The gang, the ancient figures, they had all been built on fear, on the belief that they could overpower anyone who stood in their way. But that fear was losing its grip. The figures began to dissolve into the darkness, their once ominous presence fading into the night. Amara felt a surge of strength within her, as though something inside had finally been released. And then, just as suddenly as it had begun, silence returned. Amara took a deep breath, her chest rising and falling as the tension in the air began to lift. The neighborhood that had once felt suffocating now seemed quieter, calmer, as though it had been restored to its rightful balance. Leo turned to her, his expression calm but solemn. "It's not over," he said quietly. "But for now, they're gone." Marcus stepped beside Amara, his gaze steady. "They may have taken from us before, but they can't take the future." Amara looked at both of them, her heart still racing, but her mind clearer than before. For the first time, she felt a flicker of hope. The darkness had lifted, and though the past would always remain a part of them, they had survived. As they turned to leave the broken streets behind, Amara realized something unexpected. The fight wasn't over, but they had the strength to face whatever lay ahead. And perhaps in some way, they had all become something more than they had ever imagined. As they walked away from the now quiet streets, Amara couldn't help but glance back one last time. The neighborhood looked different in the soft glow of the streetlights. There was still a hint of the old tension in the air, but something had shifted, like the weight that had been hanging over them was finally lifting. Her mind raced as they made their way down the familiar streets, each step bringing a mix of relief and uncertainty. What had just happened felt too surreal to fully process. The gang had disappeared, the ancient figures seemed to have faded into nothingness, and yet, Amara couldn't shake the feeling that something remained just beneath the surface. "Do you think they'll come back?" Amara asked, her voice soft. Leo glanced at her, his expression calm but thoughtful. "They always do, in some form or another. But next time, we'll be ready." Amara nodded, her stomach tightening. The thought of facing them again was terrifying, but she couldn't let herself live in fear. Not anymore. The experience had changed her. Marcus, walking ahead of them, remained quiet, his gaze distant. Amara knew he was lost in thought, just like she was. They had all been changed by what had happened, but whether for better or worse, they didn't know yet. "The past doesn't just disappear," Marcus finally said, turning to face them. His tone was steady, but there was a new weight to his voice. "We carry it with us, whether we want to or not." Amara swallowed hard. The truth in his words was inescapable. The past had shaped them, whether it was the gang, the ancient figures, or the unresolved mysteries of her own family. The more she thought about it, the clearer it became. Their journey wasn't over. Leah placed a hand on Amara's shoulder, his gaze filled with quiet reassurance. "But we're not the same people who started this. We've changed because of what we've faced." She smiled faintly, a flicker of hope beginning to bloom within her. Maybe that's enough. They continued walking, the sounds of the neighborhood now calmer, almost serene. The streets that once felt like a battleground had started to feel like home again. It wasn't perfect, but it was the beginning of something new. As they turned the corner, Amara glanced ahead, her eyes scanning the horizon. There was still so much she didn't know, so many unanswered questions about her family, about the neighborhood, about herself. But for the first time, she didn't feel entirely lost. In the distance, she spotted a figure standing under a street lamp. It wasn't the gang, nor those dark figures from earlier. It was a lone figure watching them from a distance. Amara couldn't make out their face, but something about them felt familiar. A memory stirred in the back of her mind, faint but undeniable. Leo and Marcus noticed her hesitation and turned back. "Amara?" Leo asked, his voice low. She didn't answer right away, her gaze still fixed on the figure in the distance. Slowly they approached. The figure stood motionless, just watching them, as though waiting for something. Amara felt her heart race as she drew closer. "Do you know them?" Marcus asked, his tone cautious. "I don't know," Amara whispered, unsure of what she was feeling. "But something tells me I should." The figure stepped forward, their form becoming clearer. Amara's breath hitched as she recognized the familiar face, the face she had seen in her dreams, the face that haunted her thoughts. It was her father. Tears filled Amara's eyes as she took a step closer, unsure of what this moment meant. "Dad." Her voice cracked. Her father's expression softened, his gaze filled with both sadness and relief. "Amara," he said, his voice trembling. "I've been searching for you." Her world tilted, the pieces of her past slowly falling into place. The gang, the ancient figures, the unanswered questions, they all tied back to her family's disappearance. Her father had been trying to protect her, trying to uncover the truth all along. Leo and Marcus stepped back, giving Amara space, their expressions filled with a quiet understanding. Amara felt overwhelmed, but not afraid. For the first time, she wasn't walking blindly into the unknown. "We've got work to do," her father said, his voice strong. "But now you're not alone." Amara nodded, her eyes filled with newfound determination. The journey wasn't over, but for the first time, she knew she wasn't facing it alone. The past would always be a part of her, but with her father by her side, she had the strength to carry it forward. Together, they walked into the night, the echoes of the past fading behind them. And though the road ahead was uncertain, one thing was clear: they were ready.